The morning Evelyn Beckett tumbled off the edge of the Juniper Creek Trail and found herself clinging to a pine root 30 feet below the path. She thought with absolute certainty that she was going to die alone in the Colorado wilderness. And then she heard boots on gravel above her. It was the autumn of 1883, and the San Juan Mountains did not forgive mistakes. They never had. Settlers had been threading their way through these ranges for decades now, following the old trapper routes and the newer mining roads that cut through stone and pine like wounds that never healed. The railroad had pushed as far as Durango the year before, and with it came a new wave of people, merchants, speculators, families looking to plant roots in soil that had never been theirs to claim. It was a complicated kind of progress, the sort that built towns on bones and called it civilization. Evelyn had not come to Colorado with stars in her eyes. She was 28 years old, sharp-tongued when the occasion demanded, and practical in the way that a woman raised in hard circumstances tends to become practical, not because she chose it, but because softness had never gotten her anywhere. She had grown up in St. Louis with a father who worked the riverboats and a mother who took in laundry until her hands bled. When her mother died of consumption in the spring of 1882, and her father disappeared somewhere down the Mississippi 6 months later, Evelyn sold everything worth selling and bought herself a one-way ticket toward something different. She had a cousin in Silverton named Margaret who had married a mine foreman and supposedly lived well. Margaret's letters were infrequent and brief, but they painted a picture of a decent house and a decent life, and that was enough. Evelyn had packed 2 trunks, shipped one ahead, and boarded the train in St. Louis with the smaller one on her lap and her heart somewhere between dread and determination. The train got her to Durango. A wagon got her most of the way to Silverton. And then the wagon driver, a wiry old man named Perkins who smelled of tobacco and regret, took a wrong fork somewhere above Cascade Creek and spent the better part of 2 hours arguing with himself before admitting they were lost. When he found the main road again, it was late afternoon, and the shadows were already pooling in the valley below. They stopped for the night at a way station that was barely more than a lean-to and a cold fire pit. There were 3 other passengers, a young couple heading to the mining camps who barely spoke to anyone else, and a traveling preacher named Hollies who talked too much about salvation and not enough about practical matters. Evelyn slept with her back against her trunk and her coat pulled over her shoulders. The next morning, Hollies announced he knew a shortcut. The wagon driver was skeptical. The young couple didn't care. Evelyn, who had spent most of her life learning the hard way not to trust men who announced they knew shortcuts, said nothing but filed the concern away. She was right to worry. The shortcut turned out to be a narrow trail that ran along the side of a ridge above Juniper Creek, barely wide enough for a single horse and utterly unsuitable for a wagon. Perkins refused to take the wagon any further, and after a heated exchange that left the preacher red-faced and sputtering, it was decided that Evelyn and Hollies would proceed on foot along the trail, while Perkins took the wagon back down to the main road and came around the long way to meet them at the base of the far ridge. It was not a good plan. Evelyn knew it was not a good plan. But she also knew that her second trunk was already in Silverton, and that her cousin was expecting her, and that the alternative was spending another night at the way station listening to Perkins snore and Hollies pray. So she tied her bag over her shoulder, laced her boots tight, and started walking. They made it perhaps 2 miles before Hollies twisted his ankle on a loose stone and sat down heavily on a rock with a sound that was half grunt and half prayer. He insisted he was fine. He was not fine. His ankle swelled inside his boot, while Evelyn watched with diminishing patience, and within 20 minutes it was clear he could not walk. She helped him settle against a boulder, left him with the water canteen, and told him she would find help or mark the trail for Perkins to follow. She walked alone for another half-mile before the trail narrowed to almost nothing along the edge of a limestone drop. She was moving carefully, her right hand pressed against the rock face, when a sudden noise, a loose stone tumbling, a bird taking flight, Something startling and sharp made her sidestep. Her left foot found nothing but air. And then the world tilted, and she was sliding, scrabbling, grabbing for anything solid, until her palms found a thick exposed pine root that stopped her fall with a jerk that nearly pulled her arms from their sockets. She hung there, catching her breath, staring at the rock face 6 inches from her nose, listening to her own heartbeat. Below her, the ground sloped steeply away into a gulch choked with juniper and scrub oak. Above her, the trail edge was maybe 5 feet out of reach. Her bag had fallen away in the slide and she could hear it crashing through the brush below. That was when she heard the boots. They were unhurried. That was the first thing she noticed. The sound of a man who was not running but was covering ground steadily, the way a person walks when they have spent a great deal of time walking and no longer think about it. She heard him stop. "There is someone down there," a voice said. It was not said to her. It was said the way a man talks when he is alone and has gotten into the habit of narrating things to himself. "Yes," Evelyn called up, because she was not going to wait for him to work through the observation. "There is someone down here. I could use a hand." A pause, then, "How far down?" "Far enough that I cannot reach the trail, close enough that I can hear you clearly." Another pause, longer this time. She heard him moving along the edge above her, the scrape of boots on stone, and then his face appeared over the lip of the trail, or at least the lower half of it, the rest obscured by the shadow of a hat brim. She could see a jaw dark with several days of beard, a chin that had a small scar running through it, and eyes that, even from this distance, were the kind of pale gray-green that made her think of creek water running over flat stones. "Can you hold on?" he asked. "I have been holding on," she said. That is rather the whole problem. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that one might have existed in another life. He disappeared. She heard him moving, and then the sound of something, a rope, she realized, being uncoiled, and then a loop of braided hemp came snaking down over the edge toward her. "Get it around your waist," he said. "I have the other end on a rock anchor. Do not let go of the root until the rope is tight." She did what he said. It took longer than she would have liked because her hands were trembling slightly, but she got the loop around herself and pulled it snug and called up that she was ready. The rope went taut. She let go of the root. He pulled her up in slow, steady increments, hand over hand, and when she got her fingers over the edge of the trail, she scrambled up the last bit herself, driven by something between relief and pride. She rolled onto the flat surface and lay there for a moment, staring at the sky, breathing. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She sat up. "My pride, mostly." She got her first clear look at him then. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the lean, weathered build of a man who worked outdoors and never carried an ounce more than he needed to. His clothes were worn but clean, a dark flannel shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled at least twice. The hat was a wide-brimmed brown felt, pushed back slightly now, and beneath it was a face that was hard to age, precisely somewhere in his late 30s, she thought, with the kind of lines that came more from sun and wind than from years. His hair was dark, going to gray at the temples and too long, brushing his collar. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not alarm, not pity. Something more careful than either of those things. "Silas Hayes," he said. Not offered like a social pleasantry, more like information he thought she might need. "Evelyn Beckett," she said. "I am traveling to Silverton." "My companion twisted his ankle about half a mile back and I left him against a boulder. I should go back to him." "I know where he is," Silas said. He coiled the rope with practiced efficiency as he spoke. "I heard him before I heard you. He is sitting down and he is not in danger, just uncomfortable." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her skirt. There were tears in the fabric at the knee that she would have to mend. "And you just walked past him." "I was coming to see what was further along the trail." He glanced at her. "Found out." "Well," she said, because she was not quite sure how to respond to that. "Thank you." He gave a short nod and turned back up the trail in the direction she had come from, and she followed him because there was nothing else to do. They walked in silence for a moment, and she found herself watching him move. He was completely at ease on this trail that had nearly killed her. His feet seemed to find the solid ground automatically, without thought, the way a man moves through terrain he has crossed 1,000 times. "Do you live near here?" she asked. "Yes." "In Silverton?" "No." She waited, but that was apparently all he intended to say on the subject. "And where then?" He gestured upward, a brief tilt of his head toward the higher ridges, where the pine gave way to bare rock and the sky opened up cold and enormous. "Up there." She looked up. The mountain above them was dense with spruce and pine for a few 100 feet, and then the tree line broke and the ridge continued in bare gray stone all the way to a peak that still had a fringe of last winter's snow in the shadowed north faces. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are also slightly terrible. "Up there," she repeated, "in a town, in a cabin, alone." He looked at her briefly. Yes, she absorbed this. There were hermit types in the mountains, trappers, prospectors, men who had gone to the high country for one reason or another and never quite came back down. She had heard of them. She had not expected to meet one on a narrow trail at 9 in the morning after nearly falling to her death. They reached Holly's a few minutes later. The preacher was sitting where she had left him, boot removed, ankle wrapped in his own neckerchief, and he looked enormously relieved when he saw them coming. He was a round man in his 50s with a red face and small, earnest eyes, and he pumped Silas's hand with both of his own and thanked God 3 times in the space of 30 seconds. Silas checked the ankle with impersonal efficiency, declared it sprained but not broken, and said he could help them down to the main road below. It would take about an hour. He had a mule at the bottom that could carry the preacher the rest of the way to where the wagon would come around. Holly's asked how far to Silverton from the road. "Another 4 hours by wagon," Silas said. "Less if the road is dry." Holly's looked at the sky. "Will it hold?" Silas looked at the sky too, and Evelyn watched him look at it. He read it the way she might read a letter, with a kind of quiet attention that extracted meaning she could not see. "It will hold today," he said. "There is weather coming tonight, though. You should be in Silverton before dark." He was right about the mule, a big-boned gray animal with a philosophical expression, who was tied to a pine at the base of the trail, and accepted Holly's weight without complaint. Silas led it with one hand and walked beside Evelyn on the narrow road below with the other, and they walked like that for a while, the preacher murmuring prayers above them and the mountain rising on their left and the valley dropping away on their right, and neither of them spoke. "Why 10 years?" Evelyn said at some point. He looked at her. "Pardon. You said you live alone up there. How long?" "I did not say how long." "No," she agreed. "I am asking." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then, 10 years, she thought about that. She had been 18 when he went up that mountain. She had been scrubbing laundry beside her mother and wondering what the rest of her life was going to look like. He had been, mid to late 20s probably, and he had gone up into the San Juans and stayed there for a decade. She could not quite shape the question she wanted to ask, so she asked a simpler one. "Do you come down often?" "When I need supplies," he said. "Durango mostly, sometimes Silverton. But not to," she searched for the word, "not to be with people." "No." "Do you not miss it?" He thought about this with the same seriousness he seemed to give everything. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to." They reached the main road 40 minutes later, and true to Perkins' word, the wagon was already there, the old driver dozing on the bench with his hat over his face. He startled awake at the sound of hooves and greeted them with a mixture of guilt and relief, and there was a brief complicated exchange about the shortcut and whose fault the whole thing had been, which ended inconclusively with everyone climbing into the wagon. Silas helped Holly's down from the mule. He tied the animal to the back of the wagon. He handed Evelyn up to the wagon bench without being asked, and the brief contact of his hand under her elbow, warm through her sleeve, steady and sure, made her suddenly aware of the fact that she had been gripping her own hands together for the last hour without quite knowing why. She looked down at him from the wagon seat. The morning light was full on his face now, and she could see the pale color of his eyes clearly, that gray-green that she kept trying to name and couldn't. He was looking at her with an expression that she still couldn't read, but she thought she recognized something in it that she had felt herself in recent years. The look of a person who is surprised by something and is not yet sure if the surprise is good. "Thank you," she said again. "For the rope, for your help." "It was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing," she said. "I would have been in serious trouble without you." Something moved in his face. "You would have figured something out," he said. "You seem like someone who does." The wagon jolted forward. She turned to look back at him once, just once, as they rolled away down the road towards Silverton, and he was still standing there beside his mule, watching them go. She told herself it was simply gratitude, what she felt. She told herself that made sense. Silverton in the autumn of 1883 was a rough-edged, sharp-tempered, surprisingly alive little place. It sat in a high valley at nearly 10,000 feet, ringed by mountains on all sides, and the altitude hit Evelyn like a physical thing when she stepped off the wagon. A sudden thinness of air that made her dizzy for a moment before she steadied herself. The town had a main street of brick-fronted buildings and half a dozen cross streets of wood-frame houses, and it smelled of coal smoke and horse and pine, and it made a constant, irregular noise of hammers and wagon wheels and distant mining machinery. Margaret was waiting outside her house on Reese Street, and she was nothing at all like her letters. The letters had been careful and brief and slightly formal. Margaret herself was tall, broad-shouldered, with red hands and an enormous warm laugh, and an embrace that nearly took Evelyn off her feet. She had 3 children, a boy of 8 named Clem, a girl of 5 named Rose, and a baby in arms whose name was George, and a husband named Robert who came home from the mine at suppertime smelling of dynamite and looking tired but pleased with himself. They fed Evelyn beef stew and fresh bread and strong coffee, and she sat at their table and felt the tension of the last 2 days leaving her like water draining from a basin. Clem peppered her with questions about St. Louis and whether she had been on a riverboat and whether she had ever seen a buffalo. Rose sat beside her and leaned against her arm without saying anything at all. The baby slept. Margaret asked her what her plans were, and Evelyn said she had some money saved and hoped to find work, perhaps teaching or bookkeeping, and she would find a room and figure out the rest. Margaret said she would do nothing of the sort and would stay with them until she was settled, and the look on her face made it clear this was not a negotiation. Evelyn stayed 3 nights, and on the 4th morning she went looking for work. She found it faster than she expected. A general merchant named Abner Cord had recently lost his bookkeeper to the silver mines. The man had apparently decided there was more money to be made underground than behind a ledger, and he interviewed Evelyn for 35 minutes, tested her arithmetic twice, and offered her a position on the spot. The pay was not generous, but it was consistent, and the work was orderly and suited to her particular mind. She found a room at the boarding house on Blair Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Abigail Fry, who had a strict policy about gentlemen callers, but was otherwise perfectly agreeable. The room was small and clean, with a single window that looked out over the narrow yard and the fence and the back of the livery stable beyond. She was, by any reasonable measure, beginning to build something, a life of a kind. And yet, 3 weeks after arriving in Silverton, she was sitting at Cord's store doing the week's accounts, and she looked up from the ledger for a reason she could not explain, and through the window she saw a man on the far side of the street tying a mule to the hitching post outside the hardware store. He was tall and lean, and wore a brown felt hat that she recognized immediately. Her pencil went still in her hand. She watched him go into the hardware store. She told herself to go back to the ledger. She did not go back to the ledger for quite some time. When Silas came out of the hardware store 20 minutes later carrying a coil of wire and a paper-wrapped parcel, she had already gone outside and was standing on the boardwalk in front of Cord's with a reason she had invented and then mostly forgotten. He saw her. He stopped. "Miss Beckett," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She was pleased to find that her voice was entirely steady. "I did not know you came to Silverton." "Occasionally," he said. "I am working here," she said, gesturing at Cord's behind her. "I found a position." He nodded. He seemed to be doing that thing again, that considering thing, where he looked at a situation with steady, careful attention before responding to it. It should have been unsettling. It was not unsettling. "You got settled then," he said. "I am getting there." A pause, not an uncomfortable one. The street moved around them, horses and wagons and two men arguing outside the saloon, and a woman hanging laundry on the second-floor railing of the hotel, and they stood in the middle of all of it like a quiet place. "I am glad you arrived safely," he said at last. "After the trail." "I thought about you," she said, and then felt her face warm because it came out more plainly than she had intended it to. "I mean, I thought about what you said, that I would have figured something out." Something almost happened to his mouth. "Did you?" "I thought about it because I was not sure if you were right," she said. "I think I might have been in real trouble." "You were in real trouble," he said simply. "I did not say you were not. You said I would figure something out." "Those are not contradictory things." She looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with those impossible pale eyes, and she had the sudden vertiginous sense that this man, this quiet, solitary, self-contained person who had spent a decade alone on a mountain, was actually paying more attention to her than most people had in years. "Would you?" she started, and then stopped, and then started again. "There is a decent restaurant on Green Street if you have not eaten. I have a dinner hour." He looked at her for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. "Then all right," he said. That was how it started. He came to Silverton about once a month that autumn, and gradually, so gradually that she could not have pointed to the moment it shifted, each visit included dinner, and then a walk, and then conversation that stretched past the hour she had allotted for it and ate into the evening. He was not an easy person to know. He gave information about himself slowly, the way a man hands out provisions when he is not sure how long the journey will be. But there was a quality to his attention, to the way he listened, that made her want to keep talking, and she found herself saying things to him that she had not said to anyone. She told him about her mother and the laundry and the long, slow decline of consumption. He listened to all of it. He did not offer platitudes or empty comfort. He said, "That sounds like a hard way to lose someone," and the simplicity of it was better than any number of more elaborate condolences. She asked him, over their second dinner at the restaurant on Green Street, what had taken him up the mountain 10 years ago. He was quiet for a while, turning his coffee cup in both hands. Then he said, "There was a woman. I planned to marry her. She died of a fever in the spring of 1873. I went up to the cabin we had started building together and I stayed." "I am sorry," Evelyn said. "It was a long time ago. That does not always make it smaller." He looked at her across the table. "No," he said, "it does not." He paused. "I think I stayed because I did not know what else to do, and then I stayed because I got used to it, and then I stayed because—" He stopped. "Because it was easier than coming back." He set his coffee cup down. "Yes." "And now?" she asked, and immediately wondered if the question was too much, but he answered it. "Now," he said, "I am not sure it is easier." She walked back to her boarding house that night and stood at her window for a long time looking out at the dark shape of the mountains above the town. The weeks turned and the air got sharper, and the first real snow came in November. A serious snowfall that dropped a foot on Silverton overnight and turned everything white and still and very beautiful. Evelyn borrowed a pair of overshoes from Margaret and walked to work through it, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she thought about Sela's up on that mountain above the snowline and wondered what it was like up there. He came down in early December, unexpected and slightly earlier than his usual interval, and appeared at the door of Cord's store one afternoon with snow on his hat brim and his coat. She looked up and felt her heart do something that she was getting fairly tired of pretending was nothing. "There is something I want to show you," he said, "if you can be spared." Cord was in the back counting inventory. She called to him that she needed an hour. He said nothing that sounded like objection. Sela's had brought a second horse, a sturdy bay mare with a mild temperament. In addition to his mule, and he helped her up without a word, and led them both along the western road out of town, and then up a trail that switched back through the pines for about 20 minutes. The snow was deep on the trail, and the horses moved through it patiently, their breath steaming, and the trees around them held the snow on their branches in heavy white sleeves. The trail opened up onto a south-facing ledge, maybe a quarter-mile wide, that looked out over the entire valley. Silverton was below them, small and distinct as a model, the smoke from its chimneys going straight up in the still air. Beyond it, the mountains ran away in every direction, ridge after ridge, blue and white and gray, all the way to the horizon. "I come here sometimes," Silas said. He was standing beside her, looking out, not at her. "When I need to remember that things are larger than they seem from close up." She looked out at it. The whole vast, impossible landscape. She had never been a person who was easily moved to silence, but she was silent now for a long time. "Your cabin," she said eventually, "is it above here?" "Another 2 miles up." He gestured north along the ridge. "Have you built it up much in 10 years?" "Some. It is solid now. It was rough when I first went up." He paused. "I added a second room 3 years ago. I am not sure why. I did not need the space." She looked at him. He was still looking at the valley. "I think part of you knew," she said, "that you would not be alone forever." His jaw tightened very slightly. She thought maybe she had said too much, had pushed too far into something he was not ready for, but he turned and looked at her then directly with those creek-water eyes that she had been thinking about for 2 months. "I think," he said slowly, "that I did not want to believe that. And now," he said, "I keep finding reasons to come down the mountain." They were standing very close together. The cold was sharp around them, and the valley was spread below them like a gift, and she was aware of the exact distance between her shoulder and his arm, the warmth of it in the cold air. "Silas," she said. "Evelyn," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, not with hesitation, the way a man who has thought about something for a long time and finally decided to do it. Her gloved fingers closed around his gloved fingers, and they stood like that looking out at the mountains together, and it was the simplest and most complicated thing that had ever happened to her. He came down the mountain more often after that, every 2 weeks, then every week. The people of Silverton, who noticed everything and talked about half of it, began to recognize the gray mule at the hitching post and the tall, quiet mountain man figure beside it. And there were conversations of the speculative variety in the hardware store, and at the saloon, and certainly at Abigail Fry's boarding house table. Margaret told Evelyn that Robert thought Silas was a good man, and that Robert was generally a reliable judge of such things. Evelyn said she was glad to hear it. Margaret gave her a look that she remembered from childhood, the look that meant she was not fooling anyone. She and Silas ate dinner together on Wednesday evenings when he was in town, and sometimes walked along the road above town in the late afternoons, and sometimes simply sat in the common room of the boarding house under Mrs. Fry's watchful eye and talked, or did not talk, in the companionable way of two people who have gotten used to each other's silence. She learned things about him in pieces. He had grown up in Tennessee, the youngest of 3 brothers, and had come west with the second wave of migration after the war. He had prospected without success, worked cattle for a time on a spread in New Mexico, and had been heading further north when he met the woman he eventually loved and followed her family to the San Juans. Her name had been Clara. He said it without apparent pain now, just as a name, the way you say the name of a place you once lived. He read. This surprised her, though she did not know why it should. He read carefully and widely history, natural science, the occasional novel that found its way up to the mountain. He had opinions about things that had no immediate practical application, like the settlement policies that continued to push indigenous people off lands they had inhabited for centuries, and he said those opinions plainly and without hedging, which she respected. The Ute people had agreements with the government, he said one evening, when the topic came up in a way she could not now remember, something about a headline in the newspaper, some piece of political news from Denver. Written agreements. The government broke them. That is not civilization, that is just taking by another method. Most people do not say that out loud, she said. Most people know it, he said. They just find it inconvenient to say. She looked at him. You are an interesting man, Silas Hayes. He looked almost uncomfortable. I'm a man who has had a great deal of time to sit and think, he said. Some people sit and think for years and come out smaller, she said. You did not. He said nothing to that, but the expression on his face was one she was beginning to know, a kind of careful, wondering attention, as though he was recalibrating something. December deepened, and Christmas came, and Silas spent it in Silverton for the first time in perhaps a decade. Margaret had him to dinner along with Evelyn, and the evening was loud and warm and full of children and Robert's off-key singing of hymns. And at one point Silas was sitting on the floor helping young Clem build a small wooden fort, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway watching him, and felt something shift in her chest that was not subtle, and was not ambiguous, and was not going away. He walked her home from Margaret's that night through snow that was falling lightly and making everything soft and muffled. It was very late, the town mostly dark and quiet, and their footsteps were the only sound. She stopped in front of Mrs. Fry's gate and turned to him. I want to ask you something, she said. All right, he said. I want to see the cabin. He was quiet. I know that may seem, she started. No, he said. It does not seem anything. He looked at her. I have been thinking about asking you the same thing. I want to show it to you. I want you to see it. She understood what this meant in the way that you understand things that have not been spoken plainly. The cabin was his whole life, the concentrated form of 10 years of solitude and work and grief and slow, stubborn recovery. Showing it to her was not a small thing. Then show me, she said. They went up in January, on a clear, cold day when the sky was the color of blue glass, and the snow on the mountain was deep and crisp, and the air smelled of pine resin and cold stone. He had brought the bay mare for her again, and they rode up through the trees in a silence that was warm rather than empty, and she watched the valley fall away below them and felt a feeling she could not immediately name, something between adventure and arrival. The cabin was near the top of a long southern slope just below the main ridge, set into the mountain, so the rock face formed part of the back wall and insulated it against the worst of the weather. It was larger than she had pictured, 2 solid rooms, the second one he had added, built of dressed timber with a stone chimney and a covered porch. There was a small outbuilding for the animals and a woodpile that was enormous and perfectly ordered, and a cleared path between the cabin and a spring that was kept from freezing by its constant movement. The inside was spare but not bare. Books were stacked on shelves made of split timber. There was a good iron stove and a table and 2 chairs, and a braided rug of dark colors that he said he had made himself, one winter when the weather kept him inside for 3 straight weeks. There were tools hung in order on one wall and a gun rack with 2 rifles that were clean and well maintained. The second room had a bed and a trunk and another bookshelf, and that was all. She stood in the doorway of the second room for a moment. He stood behind her. I built this room 3 years ago, he said. You mentioned that, she said softly. I told myself it was for storage, he said. She turned around. He was very close. The afternoon light came through the one window and caught the line of his jaw and the gray at his temples and the careful, uncertain look in his eyes that she found she loved, that she had been finding she loved for months now without letting herself say so. And what was it really for, she asked. I think, he said, I think it was for something I did not know how to want yet. She reached up and put her palm flat against his chest over his heart. She could feel it beating through the flannel of his shirt steady, a little faster than usual, very real. I love you, she said, not as a test, not tentatively. As a statement of fact offered plainly, the way she offered things she was certain of. His breath changed. His hand came up and covered hers against his chest. His eyes went from uncertain to something else entirely, something that made her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. I have been trying, he said, for months to figure out how to say that to you. "It is not a complicated sentence," she said. "It is the most complicated sentence I know," he said. "When you mean it. Do you mean it, Evelyn?" His voice was very low. "I have been meaning it since you were hanging off that mountain and complained to me about your pride." She laughed. She had not meant to laugh, but it came out of her anyway, warm and real, and something in his face opened at the sound of it. Opened the way a window opens and lets the air in, changing the whole room. He kissed her. Slowly, with both hands cupping her face as though she was something valuable, and the stove was warm behind her, and the mountain was cold and enormous outside the window, and she put her arms around him and kissed him back and thought, This is what arriving feels like. They stayed up at the cabin until the light started going golden and low, and then rode back down to Silverton together in the amber late afternoon, not speaking much but close to each other on the trail, the horses picking their way through the snow with patient ease. She felt different on the way down than she had on the way up. Not lighter exactly, solider, more certain of her own foothold. February arrived with a particular ferocity, the way Colorado winters do when they want to remind you that spring is not guaranteed. The snow came down in sheets for days at a time, and Silas could not come down from the mountain for 3 weeks, and the 3 weeks were long in a way that the preceding months had not prepared her for. She was busy. She had work, and she had Margaret and the children, and she had her books and the small, busy life of Silverton around her. But she found herself in the evenings, sitting at her window and looking up at the mountains, which she could see when the weather broke, wondering what he was doing. Wondering if the extra room was as empty as it had been before she saw it. His first letter arrived in mid-February, delivered by a trapper who came down through Silverton every few weeks. The handwriting was careful and a little stiff, the handwriting of a man who does not write often but writes deliberately. It said, "The mountain is impressive in this weather. I have been reading Gibbon. I have been thinking about you every single day. I am not accustomed to missing things, but I find I am very much accustomed to missing you. I hope you are well and warm. I hope you have been eating properly. I know that is a presumptuous thing to say. I find I don't mind being presumptuous where you are concerned." She read it 4 times and then put it away in the small box where she kept the things she meant to keep. She wrote back that same evening. Her letter was longer than his. She wrote the way she talked, in connected thoughts that built on each other, and she sent it back with the same trapper the following week. When the weather broke in early March, he came down the mountain on a Tuesday afternoon and appeared at Cord's store at 2:30, and when she looked up from the ledger, she felt the same thing she always felt at the sight of him, that lift, that specific recalibration of the air. He asked her to walk with him that evening. They walked out along the western road as the sun went down, the mountains burning orange and copper above them, and he was quiet for a while, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind with something in it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She had asked him that before, she remembered, standing at Mrs. Fry's gate in the snow, asking to see the cabin. She felt a warmth move through her. "Ask me," she said. He stopped walking. He turned to face her. In the last of the evening light, his face was serious and open, both at once, and he was holding his hat in his hands rather than wearing it, which she had never seen him do before. "I know this is not what is expected," he said. "I am not a conventional man. I have no great fortune and a considerable history of not being present in the world. I have a cabin on a mountain and a mule and more books than is probably practical. I do not know that I can change everything about the life I have built up there, and I would not want you to." He stopped. "Try it again. What I mean to say is that the life I would offer you is not easy. It is cold and it is sometimes solitary, and it requires a kind of hardness that I am not sure I have any right to ask of anyone." "Silas," she said gently. "I am getting there," he said. She pressed her lips together to contain a smile. "What I am saying," he said, "is that despite all of that and fully aware of all of that, I want to offer it to you anyway, because I think you are the strongest, most honest, most surprising person I have ever known, And because the cabin is empty without you, and because I spent 10 years being alone on that mountain and thought it suited me and I was wrong. I was waiting without knowing what I was waiting for. He looked at her directly. Marry me, Evelyn. Come up the mountain. The mountains were on fire with the sunset, and the first stars were coming up in the east, and somewhere below them, Silverton was making its ordinary noise of living, and she stood in the middle of it and looked at this serious, quiet, extraordinary man who had pulled her off a cliff 4 months ago and changed the shape of everything. Yes, she said. They were married in April, when the trails cleared, and the last of the deep snow had retreated to the high north faces. Margaret made her a dress out of blue wool practical for the altitude, she said, and also the color of the sky up here, which seemed appropriate. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace named Cooper, who had an office on Green Street and a businesslike manner that was not at all festive but got the job done. Hollis, the traveling preacher, was not there. He had long since continued on his way to wherever traveling preachers continued on their way to. But Margaret was there, beaming, with all 3 of her children in their best clothes, and Robert was there, looking proud in the way that men look proud at other people's weddings, and Abner Cord came and stood in the back and gave them a set of good iron cookware as a gift. Mrs. Fry sent flowers. Silas wore a dark coat she had not seen before, which she suspected Margaret had something to do with, and his hair had been cut to a reasonable length, and he stood at the front of Cooper's office and watched her come toward him with an expression on his face that she was going to think about for the rest of her life. Unguarded, undone by wonder, the look of a man who cannot believe his luck. She moved into the cabin on the mountain in late April, and the adjustment was real and not always easy. She had not been naive about what she was taking on. The altitude meant hard winters and short growing seasons. The isolation meant that the nearest neighbor was a trapper named Bert who lived 3 miles along the ridge and came by perhaps twice a month. The work was constant water and wood and food, and the 1,000 small maintenances that a mountain homestead demands. But she had been practical her whole life, and she was still practical, and she found that she was suited to it in ways she had not predicted. The early mornings, when the sun came up through the trees and turned the snow to gold, and the air was sharp and entirely clean, those were worth everything. The evenings when they sat by the stove and he read and she mended or wrote letters or did accounts for Cord by mail were the most contented hours she had ever lived. She kept her arrangement with Cord, sending him monthly accounts by post, and he paid her accordingly. It was not a large income, but it was hers, and she valued that. Silas, for his part, was visibly different. There was a quality that had begun to ease out of him, something she could not quite name, a kind of held breath that he had been breathing for 10 years and was only now releasing. He laughed more. Not constantly, not broadly. He was not a broadly laughing man, but with increasing frequency, and with a quality of fullness that told her the laughter was real all the way down. He taught her to read the mountain, the signs of weather, the paths the animals used, which plants were useful and which were not. She taught him things too, things that surprised him. She could read a financial ledger with the speed of a card player, and she could argue a point with a clarity and force that regularly left him sitting back in his chair with an expression of intellectual respect that was also, she suspected, slightly inconvenient for him. They disagreed sometimes. Real disagreements, the kind that could only happen between people who knew each other well enough to go to the actual bones of a difference. She believed in engaging with the world more than he did going down to Silverton, being present in the community, making herself known. He believed in the value of distance from a world that was, he felt, often doing things worth being distant from. They argued about this in the good way, honestly, without cruelty, and reached accommodations that left neither of them feeling they had lost themselves. Summer came and the mountain changed completely, became a different version of itself, green and loud with wind and the constant sound of water. the snowfields reduced to patches in the deep shadow of the north faces, the air full of wildflowers and bees, and the enormous, undeniable life of a high-altitude summer. Evelyn walked the trails with a purpose and confidence that was entirely new, and sometimes she walked to the ledge where Silas had taken her in December and stood there looking at the valley and thought about how strange and specific the path had been, all the choices and mischances that had delivered her to this exact spot. A preacher really had known a shortcut. An old driver really had taken a wrong fork. She really had stepped off a cliff. And a quiet man who had been living alone on a mountain for a decade had been in exactly the right place on exactly the right morning with a rope. She told him this one evening, told him the whole chain of it. He thought about it in his way. Then he said, "I was not usually on that section of trail in the morning." She stared at him. "What?" "I normally went along the north face in the mornings." But Bert had mentioned seeing a dead pine on the south trail that was leaning toward the path, and I had gone out to take a look at it. He paused. "I had been meaning to for several days. I am not sure why I went that particular morning." She looked at him for a long moment. "You went to look at a tree," she said. "I went to look at a tree," he confirmed. She sat back and looked at the ceiling of the cabin. "A dead pine tree," she said. "It was leaning quite dangerously," he said, with a gravity that she was fairly certain was partly performed. "Silas Hayes," she said. "It still needed dealing with," he said. She laughed. She laughed until she was pressing her hand over her mouth, and he watched her with that expression she loved, the open, undone one, only now there was a thread of amusement in it too. By autumn, she knew she was carrying their child. She told him on an October evening when the aspens on the lower slopes had gone entirely to gold, and the cabin was warm and the lamp was lit, and the world outside was very quiet. She sat across the table from him and looked at him and said, simply, "We are going to have a child in the spring." He was perfectly still for a moment. Then he set down the book he had been holding and he looked at her, and she watched something happen in his face that she had never seen before, a kind of fracturing, but in the direction of opening rather than breaking. His eyes went bright. "In the spring," he said. "May, I think, possibly June." He stood up and came around the table and knelt down beside her chair and took both her hands in his and just looked at her. She looked back. They stayed like that for a while. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am better than I have ever been." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands. She could feel him breathing. "I did not think," he said after a moment. His voice was slightly unsteady. "After Clara, I stopped thinking about this, about having a family. I stopped letting myself think about it." "I know," she said softly. And now," she said, tilting her head down until her forehead touched his hair, "you are going to be a father." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I need to make the cabin safer," he said. She smiled. "Not immediately. The porch railing is not Silas. The north window needs recaulking before winter, Silas." He lifted his head and looked at her. She was smiling. He looked at her for a moment, and then something broke open in him completely, and he smiled back. A real, wide, unguarded smile that she had never seen at full force before. And it was extraordinary. It was like watching a man rediscover something he had lost so long ago he had stopped believing it was his. She went down to Silverton in November to tell Margaret, who made a sound that was approximately half shriek and half sob, and then hugged Evelyn so hard she lifted her slightly off the ground. Robert shook Silas's hand with both of his own, which was apparently his signature move for significant occasions. Clem, who was 9 now and had appointed himself Evelyn's particular friend, announced that if it was a boy he should be named after a general. Rose said she hoped it was a girl. It was a boy. He was born in the 3rd week of May, in the cabin on the mountain, with Margaret there, and a midwife from Silverton named Helen, who made the long ride up without complaint, and turned out to be one of the most competent people Evelyn had ever met. The birth was hard. All births are hard, and altitude does not improve the matter. But by the time the sun was fully up and the light was coming through the east window and filling the room with gold, the boy was there. red-faced and emphatic about his presence in the world, and Evelyn was lying back against the pillows feeling hollowed out and overwhelmingly glad. Silas had been outside during the worst of it, which was where Margaret had firmly sent him. He came in when Helen called him, and he stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, looking at Evelyn and the baby, and his face was so entirely undefended that it almost hurt to look at. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms and he held the child the way he held important things, carefully, with complete attention, his whole large hands cradling the small weight as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever been entrusted with. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, like an introduction. The baby, whose eyes were open in that unfocused way of newborns, turned toward the sound of his voice. "He knows you already," Evelyn said. Silas looked at her. His eyes were bright again. "Does he? He has been listening to you for months," she said. He swallowed. He looked back down at the boy. "What shall we call him?" They had talked about names but had not settled on one. She had a thought she had been keeping, waiting to see if it still felt right in the moment. It felt right. "Eli," she said. He turned the name over the way he turned things. "Eli Hayes," he said. "Eli Hayes," she agreed. He nodded once. He looked at his son. Outside the window, the mountain was doing what it did in May, all green and reckless with new growth. The last snow gone from everything but the highest peaks, and the sky was the particular blue that only exists at altitude, fierce and clear and very far up. Eli Hayes grew the way mountain children grow, quickly, practically, entirely unimpressed by the things that impress flatlanders. He was walking at 11 months and talking at 14, and by the time he was 2, he had strong opinions about where things belonged and how they should be organized, which he had clearly inherited from his mother. He had Silas's coloring, the dark hair and the gray-green eyes, but he had Evelyn's way of looking at things, intent and assessing and already working out the implications. Silas proved, entirely to his own apparent surprise, to be a natural father. He had been afraid of it, she knew. Not of the work or the responsibility, but of the vulnerability of it, of loving something that could be taken from you, the way Clara had been taken. But Eli made that fear irrelevant within about 4 days of his birth. The boy was so entirely and stubbornly present that there was no room to be afraid at any distance. The two of them could spend an entire afternoon on the south slope with a piece of interesting bark, and not say a word to each other that was not immediately purposeful, and come home looking entirely satisfied. Evelyn would watch them from the porch and feel a kind of deep, simple happiness that she had no fancy words for. She wrote to her cousin Margaret about this, and Margaret wrote back that it sounded exactly right, and that Clem and Rose sent their love and wanted to know when Eli was old enough to come down to Silverton and play. He came down for the first time at 18 months, strapped to his father's chest in a carrier Silas had made from canvas and leather, and the trip down the mountain was so interesting to him that he spent most of it trying to see in every direction at once, which nearly toppled them both twice. The town of Silverton was very exciting to Eli Hayes. He had opinions about all of it. He stood on the boardwalk outside Cord's store and pointed at everything and made authoritative sounds. Abner Cord, who was not a man with a great deal of patience for small children under normal circumstances, gave him a piece of horehound candy and proclaimed him a fine boy. Mrs. Fry came out of her boarding house to see him and pinched his cheeks and told Evelyn she was looking very well, with the added implication that mountain life clearly agreed with her. It did agree with her. She was 31 now, and she felt like a different person from the woman who had stepped off a wagon in Silverton 3 years earlier with a torn skirt and a determination that was more stubborn than hopeful. She was still practical. She was still sharp. But there was a quality of rootedness now that had not been there before, something anchored and sure. Silas watched her move through Silverton with the proprietary pride of a man who knows a great deal about value and is fully aware of what he has got. That evening, they sat on the step of the cabin in the long June twilight, and Eli was asleep inside, and the mountains were going purple and deep in the last of the light. And Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and they sat shoulder to shoulder and did not talk for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said, which made her smile because she had said it first once at Mrs. Fry's gate. "Ask me," she said. "Are you content?" He said it plainly, the way he said important things. "Here on the mountain." "I want to know the real answer." She looked at her coffee cup. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about important things: the winter isolation, the hard work, the cold, the altitude, the distances, the mornings that were almost unbearably beautiful, the evenings like this one, the feeling of being fully, completely known by another person for the first time in her life. "I am more than content," she said. "I am happy." Genuinely, she paused. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, not with hesitation, not with qualification. Simply and directly, the word carrying the full weight of what it meant coming from a man who had spent 10 years not being able to say it. "Yes." She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm went around her, warm and solid. Below them the valley held the last light, and above them the first stars were coming out, and she thought, this is the story of how things become different. You take a wrong turn, and a wagon driver argues with himself, and a preacher twists his ankle and you fall off a cliff, and a man goes to look at a dead tree, and everything changes. Time moved as it does in the mountains, felt both long and short, shaped by seasons rather than calendars. The second summer was hotter and drier than the first, and they dug the spring channel deeper and added a barrel cistern to the porch to collect rainwater. The third winter was the hardest they had known, a sustained cold that kept them inside for a week at a time and tested the limits of the woodpile. They came through it fine. Evelyn continued her bookkeeping for Cord by Post and eventually added a second client, a mining operation on the western side of the ridge whose foreman had heard through various means that there was a reliable bookkeeper up on the mountain. It was work she could do on her own terms, at her own table, and it mattered to her. Silas trapped in the winters for additional income and sold the pelts in Silverton. He also began to do something she had suggested, hesitantly, in their second year. He began carving. He had always whittled unconsciously when he was thinking, making small shapes that he would set aside without much attention. She had kept several of them, arranging them on the shelf with the books. When she told him they were very good, he had been genuinely skeptical. When she showed one of them, a small carved horse with an extraordinary quality of motion in the wood, to Robert, who showed it to a merchant in Silverton, and the merchant offered to buy it, Silas had been silent for a full minute. He carved through that winter with a seriousness of purpose he brought to all things, and by spring he had 15 pieces. They sold all of them within 2 months of putting them in the Silverton store. He did not say much about this, but she caught him in the workshop he had built against the north side of the cabin on more than one occasion, with that expression on his face that she associated with deep engagement, the pure attention of a person doing something that matches who they are. He was 40 years old in the spring of Eli's 3rd birthday, and she organized a birthday gathering that had far more people in it than he had anticipated: Margaret and Robert and all 3 of their children, Bert the trapper from along the ridge, Helen the midwife, Abner Cord, and 2 other families from Silverton who had become something like friends. The cabin was too small to hold all of them, so they spread out onto the south slope in the spring sunshine, and there was food, and the children ran, and Silas stood in the middle of it with an expression of slightly overwhelmed wonder that she found very endearing. "You organized this," he said to her quietly, at one point. "I did," she said. "You invited all these people to my mountain," he said. "It is our mountain," she said. He looked at her. He was 40 years old, and the sun was on his face, and his son was running toward him from across the slope with his arms out, and he looked like a man who has walked a very long way and found the place he was going. "Yes," he said, "it is." And then Eli reached him and was swept up to his father's shoulder, from which vantage point he surveyed the whole assembled gathering with the satisfaction of a small emperor, And Evelyn laughed, and the mountain stood around them, and the afternoon stretched out long and golden and full. That summer brought a letter from a man in Denver, an art dealer of some kind, who had seen one of Silas's carved pieces in a gallery in Durango. Apparently the Silverton merchant had been sending them further afield, and wanted to know if the carver would be willing to sell directly. The price offered was significantly more than the Silverton arrangement. Silas read the letter twice and handed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it and looked at him. "Well," she said. "I do not know what to do with this," he said. "You write back and say yes," she said. "It is just wood," he said. "It is not just wood," she said. "You know it is not." He was quiet. "Silas," she said gently, "you can let good things happen to you. It is allowed." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she loved, the careful, wondering one. "You make things sound very simple," he said. "Some things are simple," she said. "People complicate them." He wrote back to the man in Denver. The arrangement proved good and grew over time, and while neither of them was under any illusion that this made them wealthy, it made them comfortable in a way that took some of the hardest edges off the winters. Eli was 4 when Evelyn told Silas there would be a second child. He took it better this time, better meaning he did not immediately catalog the structural deficiencies of the cabin, or at least not for the first several minutes. He held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then said, "The porch railing still needs Silas. It is a legitimate concern." "We have months," she said. "The railing should be done before winter regardless," he said. "Then do the railing," she said, laughing. He fixed the railing the following week. He also rechanced the north window, rebuilt the storage shelf in the bedroom to create what he called a more suitable space, and carved a small cradle from a single piece of pine that was so beautiful Margaret cried when she saw it. The second child was another boy, born in November on a night when the snow was falling heavily, and Helen the midwife barely made it up the trail in time. He came into the world fast and loud and certain of himself, and he was round-faced and fair where Eli was dark, and he looked, everyone agreed, entirely like a Hayes. They named him Thomas, for Silas's oldest brother back in Tennessee with whom he had recently, tentatively, begun to exchange letters. Eli was fascinated by his brother and approached him with the careful scrutiny he applied to everything unfamiliar. He sat beside the cradle and observed the baby for long periods, and one afternoon Evelyn came in to find him speaking to Thomas in a low, serious voice, explaining, as far as she could make out, the proper arrangement of the woodpile. Thomas waved his fists in apparent agreement. She went back out to the porch and stood in the cold and laughed silently until she had to wipe her eyes. The boys grew up on that mountain with the specific confidence of children who are thoroughly known and thoroughly loved. They learned to read at the table with their parents, Silas patient and serious and thorough, Evelyn exacting about pronunciation and comprehension, and not above an argument when one of them tried to skip a passage they found difficult. Both boys were eventually sent down to the school in Silverton for 2 terms each, staying with Margaret and Robert during the week and coming home on weekends, and both came back having made friends and learned things, and missed the mountain with a specific homesickness that told Evelyn everything she needed to know about the life they had made up here. Thomas was 7 when Evelyn found herself with a 3rd pregnancy, and she sat with this knowledge for a few days before telling Silas, not because she was worried, but because she wanted to hold it a little while, the particular private pleasure of knowing something new. She told him on a February evening when the boys were asleep, and the stove was going, and the snow was making a gentle sound against the walls. He was carving, and when she told him, he set the carving down with the same stillness she remembered from the first time, and then he looked at her. "A 3rd," he said. "Yes. You are well, you feel well. I feel very well." He crossed the room and sat beside her and took her hand, and they sat together by the stove while the snow came down outside, and he did not say anything about the cabin or the railing or any structural consideration whatsoever. "A 3rd child," he said quietly. He seemed to be arranging something in himself, making room. "10 years ago I thought," he stopped. 10 years ago my life was a fixed thing. I thought it would simply continue until it ended. And now? She said the same question she had asked so many times. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it, the long habit of a man who finds his words in careful consideration. Now, he said, I cannot see the end of it. I cannot see the shape of it. There is too much of it. She looked at him. He met her eyes. That is a good thing, she said. I know it is, he said. I am just not used to it. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, and he put his arm around her and held her, and the fire went on burning and the snow went on falling, and somewhere in the mountain winter a fox cried out once and was silent, and the night held them all, snug and warm, entirely entire. The third child was a girl. She was born in September in the last of the summer heat, on a morning that was so bright and clear that Evelyn, between contractions, noticed through the open window that the aspens on the lower slope were just beginning to turn. The girl arrived quietly, differently from her brothers, with a quality of attention that Helen, who had now delivered all three Hayes children, noted with professional interest. This one is watching everything, she said. She was. She had Evelyn's eyes, dark and assessing, and she was holding her father's thumb within 2 minutes of being placed in his arms, and she did not let go. Clara, Evelyn said. She had not planned to say it. It came out of her simply, the way true things sometimes do. Silas looked up from his daughter's face. His expression was, she was not sure she had words for it, overwhelmed in several directions at once. Are you sure? He asked. She should have a name that matters, Evelyn said. That name matters to you. It matters to where you have been and who you are, and she can carry it forward. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back down at the girl in his arms, this small, serious, brand-new person. Clara Hayes, he said softly. Clara's fingers tightened around his thumb. The seasons continued. Eli grew tall and bookish, and eventually took himself back to Silverton to apprentice with Abner Cord, who was getting old and needed someone capable, and the arrangement suited everyone. He came home on Sundays, and for every holiday and whenever the mountain was doing something particularly interesting, which was often enough. Thomas, by contrast, showed every sign of becoming a man who would stay on the mountain forever. He had Silas's ease with the terrain and the weather and the quiet, and he spent hours with his father in the workshop, and was already making small carved objects with a skill that made Silas proud in the quiet, specific way of a man who recognizes something of himself in another. Clara was, from the beginning, her own thing entirely. She had opinions and she expressed them, and she read everything she could find, and she asked questions that regularly made both her parents stop what they were doing and actually think. At 5 years old, she once asked Silas why the mountains were there, and after he gave her the geological explanation, patiently, carefully, with accuracy, she said, "But why there and not somewhere else?" And he sat back and looked at her and said, "That is a genuinely good question, and I am not sure anyone knows the full answer." She seemed satisfied by this. She was a person who respected honest uncertainty. Evelyn, in her 38th year, looked at the life she had built in the San Juans and tried to see it clearly, the way she tried to see all things clearly, without the distortions of excessive hope or excessive caution. What she saw was this: a solid cabin on the side of a mountain, expanded now to 3 rooms with a proper porch and a workshop and a kitchen garden that produced more than it had any right to at this altitude. 2 boys, one in the valley and one on the ridge, both of them decent and capable and kind. A girl who was going to be formidable and knew it. A husband who was, she searched for the right word and found it, present. Entirely, completely, deliberately present. He had spent 10 years learning how to be alone, and then spent every subsequent year learning how to be with people again. And he had done it imperfectly and genuinely and without shortcuts. He still went quiet sometimes, still needed the mountain the way other men needed sleep, a restorative, necessary thing. But he came back from those distances. He always came back. She found him one late October afternoon sitting on the south ledge, the one he had taken her to all those years ago, the one where the whole valley spread out below. Clara was at his side, leaning against his arm, and they were watching something, a hawk, she thought, circling far below the ledge, riding the thermals. She sat on his other side. He put his arm around her. Below them, Silverton was small and distinct, smoke going up from its chimneys, the mountains running away on all sides to where the sky began. It was exactly as it had been the first time she had seen it, exactly the same landscape, entirely different everything. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me when you brought me up here the first time? That I came here when I needed to remember that things were larger than they seemed from close up," he said. "Yes." She leaned against him. "I think about that." Clara looked up at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," Evelyn said, thinking about it, "that when things are hard or confusing, sometimes you need to get far enough away to see the whole shape of them." Clara considered this with her characteristic seriousness. And then you go back," Silas said, "and you do what needs doing." Clara nodded. This seemed to her a satisfactory answer. She went back to watching the hawk. Silas tightened his arm around Evelyn's shoulders. She felt the solid weight of him, the familiar warmth. "Are you happy?" he asked, the same question he had asked before, years ago on that summer evening. "Yes," she said, the same answer, still true, truer. He pressed his lips to her temple, brief and warm. Below them, the valley held the afternoon light, and the mountain stood their old, enormous watch, and the hawk turned on the thermal and climbed, and was gone. The years after that had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary griefs and strains of a life that is actually being lived, but fundamentally, constitutionally good. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the year Thomas broke his arm badly falling from the shed roof, and spent 6 weeks with it in a splint, and the year Evelyn got a chest cold that went deep and frightened both of them before it finally cleared, and the year a fire in Silverton took out half of Cord's store and Eli worked for 3 weeks straight helping rebuild it. There were things that needed doing and things that went wrong, and there were the small mornings that accumulate as you move through life. Bert the trapper died of old age on his ridge one winter, and Mrs. Fry passed quietly in her boarding house bed, and Margaret lost the baby she had been expecting in her early 40s, which was a grief that took a long time to move through. But there were also Christmases when all 3 children were home, and the cabin was too full and too loud, and the table was extended with boards balanced on sawhorses, and there were spring mornings when the whole mountain smelled of melt and new growth, and there were evenings when both Silas and Evelyn were reading by the stove, and the fire was talking to itself, and outside the night was very large and very quiet, and they were both entirely at peace. Eli married a young woman named Frances at 23. She was the daughter of a Silverton printer, quick-minded and decisive and possessed of a laugh that could be heard from across the street, and they set up house in Silverton with a certain brisk efficiency that was very much Eli. He brought her up the mountain the following summer, and Silas shook her hand and Evelyn took her through the kitchen garden and Thomas showed her the workshop. And by the end of the day, Frances had correctly identified which carved pieces in the shop were Thomas's and which were Silas's, and her assessment of both was so accurate and specific that Silas looked at her with a new and evident respect. "You have a good eye," he said. "I grew up in a print shop," she said. "You get used to seeing what things are made of." "She'll do," Thomas told Evelyn afterwards. "She'll do," Evelyn agreed. Thomas himself showed no apparent interest in marrying, or at least none in anyone available in the local area, but this did not trouble his parents, who had learned not to put timelines on things that were not their business. He was 21 and skilled in content, and he was slowly building himself a structure on the north side of the ridge, a proper workshop, and eventually, he said, a small house of his own. Silas helped him with the construction on weekend mornings, and watching the two of them work together, silent and purposeful in the manner of people who communicate efficiently through shared task, was one of the ongoing pleasures of Evelyn's life. Clara went to school in Durango when she was 12, boarding with a respectable family there through the school term, and she distinguished herself in every academic subject, and came home for summers and holidays, talking about everything she had learned with an energy and breadth that filled the whole cabin. At 15, she was reading things that Silas had not gotten to yet, and she had opinions about all of them. And their dinner table conversations in those years were the kind that went late into the evening and ranged across history and science and the nature of things and what the territory ought to do about water rights. And Evelyn sat at the end of the table and listened to her husband and her youngest child argue about geology or policy or the novels of Dickens with a feeling of rightness so deep it was almost physical. On a May evening when Evelyn was 43 and Silas was 50, they sat on the porch after dinner in the long spring twilight, the mountains all around them, the valley below just beginning to hold the last of the light, and the sounds of Thomas in his workshop carrying faintly on the evening air. 50 years old, Evelyn said. Yes, he said, you do not look 50. I feel 50, he said. In my knees, she laughed. He smiled. They sat in their usual manner, shoulder to shoulder, the coffee cooling in their cups. Do you remember the first time you came to Silverton? She asked. After I arrived, when you saw me at Cord's store. You were standing on the boardwalk, he said. As if you had a reason to be there and had forgotten what it was, she looked at him. I had invented a reason to be there. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I know. You knew then? I suspected, he said. Something moved in the corner of his mouth. Silas Hayes, she said. I was glad of it, he said. She looked at him, this man who had been hers for 15 years now, this quiet and extraordinary person who had gone up a mountain in grief and come back down into life because a woman had fallen off a trail and needed a rope, who had built a second room 3 years before she arrived because some part of him was keeping faith with the future, who had learned, slowly and deliberately and completely without shortcuts, how to be present in a life again. I was glad of it too, she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same simple gesture he had made on that snow-covered ledge all those years ago. Her hand in his, the mountains all around them, the evening coming on in its slow, gorgeous way. I would go up that mountain again, he said. Every one of those 10 years, if it ended here. Me too, she said. Every wrong turn and every shortcut that wasn't a shortcut and every dead pine tree. Especially the dead pine tree, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that as the twilight went from gold to blue, and the first stars came out, and the mountains settled into their night shapes, and Thomas's hammer finally fell quiet, and the valley below breathed its ordinary evening breath, and everything was, as it had been for a long time, entirely and completely whole. In the morning she would write to Eli and Francis and tell them that spring had fully arrived on the mountain, and that the kitchen garden needed attention, and that Clara had sent a letter from Durango saying she had been invited to present a paper to her class on the geological formations of the San Juan Range. And wasn't that something? Wasn't that exactly right? In the morning there would be coffee and the sound of Thomas moving around the workshop, and the mountain doing what the mountain always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. But for now, there was just this. The porch and the evening and the hand in hers and the man beside her who had once been alone on a mountain and did not know what he was waiting for, and a woman who had fallen off a cliff and been pulled back up by someone steady, and all the years between that morning and this one, all the accumulated ordinary magnificent weight of a life fully, finally, fearlessly lived. The stars came out one by one above the San Juans, the same stars that had hung over those peaks since before any of them had names, and the mountains held the dark in their old familiar arms, and the cabin on the slope glowed warm and steady with lamplight, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.